Thank you for coming to today's program with Brit Bennett and Kara Brown. I'm Andrea Grossman, the founder of Writer's Bloc, now in our 25th season. Brit Bennett's novel, The Vanishing Half, is a study in identity on so many levels. It's about the self that you create and the self that you suppress. She leads us to the revelation that we can never really escape who we are. The Vanishing Half is a story not just about racial and gender identity, but it's also about the basic elements of family, between sisters, between mothers and daughters. It's deeply moving and it's disturbing, but I felt hopeful in the presence of these magnificent characters. The Vanishing Half will be developed for HBO, and we can't wait. If you haven't read the book, Eso Won Bookstore in Los Angeles has plenty of copies. Find the link on our website, writersblockpresents.com. Kara Brown writes for television and has covered pop culture and race for many journals, including Jezebel, and was a podcast host for Crooked Media's Keep It. Kara has just started an online book club called readabookwithkara.com, and we're doing just that right now. So it's my pleasure to bring you Brit Bennett and Kara Brown.
Hello, Brit.
Hi. Hi.
So you've heard me say this before, but your first book, The Mothers, I read in one sitting the day after the 2016 election. And then you released this book while we're in the middle of chaos. Do you know something we don't know?
No, I mean, yeah, it's honestly crazy. The Mothers, I remember that was like kind of heading into the election. I'm like going on the book tour. And then sort of that kind of cataclysmic event happens. And then with this book, I started to gradually realize that it was going to be coming out, in the middle of a global pandemic. So I'm sorry, everybody. I will try to be more conscientious for the third book.
No, I mean, I feel like you're giving us distractions. So
okay, I'm glad
that is appreciated. Obviously we all love the book, everyone tuning in. But one of the things that I love both about this book and The Mothers is that you're telling stories about Black women specifically that are not rooted in like a very deep trauma, that are not about slavery, that are not about the civil rights movement. And the types of stories that frankly like white women get told about them. And so I just am wondering, is that something that's sort of very deliberate for you, or does it just so happen that those are the stories you want to tell?
Yeah, I think both. I think for The Vanishing Half, I knew I wanted to set the book in part during the civil rights movement, but I also knew that I wasn't interested in writing about these characters who are activists or who are martyrs or who are these like kind of historical actors in a way that those are often those stories about Black people that we get narratives about, right? It's stories about sort of great Black people, the Madam C.J. Walkers and the Dr. Kings and these huge kind of larger than life figures. And for me, I was really just interested in the regular people that are just like alive during a moment and are experiencing these moments, but are also sort of experiencing their own private emotional crises alongside these larger historical crises. I think that's the way that we experience history. I think that everybody would, I think most of us would probably agree, like living through a pandemic, you're like thinking about kind of these large scale problems, but then you're also thinking about like your minor, small personal issues that we're all.
When am I going to get my eyebrows threaded?
Exactly. These types of things. So I wanted to write towards that and to kind of write these characters that are situated within these large historical moments, but thinking about their sort of small private problems within those big moments.
And so the novel is set primarily in Louisiana. And again, I was like blowing you up while I was reading this. I was like blowing her up like every 10 minutes as I turned the page, because my mother's family is from Louisiana, and my grandmother, for example, is very, very light. Like, to me, she's not passing. And maybe that's a conversation too about the concept of passing with Black people and white people, because my sister, for example, is very, very fair, same two parents, because with Black people, you never know how we're going to come out. And I think it's interesting because in some ways, although I understand it, I see someone and I'm like, oh, that's clearly a Black person, even when white people do not know. Like Adam Clayton Powell, to me, I'm like, that's obviously a Black man, although I know his hair is straight and whatever. But I just sort of talking about, you know, I think you got into colorism without getting into it the way that we usually get into it, which is a very like pitting most usually Black women, women, dark-skinned Black women and light-skinned Black women into each other. And just, you know, I'm wondering like how you sort of arrived at like tackling colorism, and if you know what you were sort of keeping in mind too while you were telling this story so that it wasn't like others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that observation that you pointed out, I think both of those things were important to me in a couple ways. I think one thing that you said was about it being a gendered conversation. And I think that that's definitely true. I think that that's often the way that conversations about color play out, because I guess it dovetails into sort of desirability and beauty and all of those very fraught topics, which are often gendered topics, as we know. So I think that was one thing I wanted to be mindful of. And I think the bigger thing that you were saying was kind of this idea of colorism being framed as a sort of dark versus light. I was not interested in engaging in that conversation.
Why?
I really...
It's such a smooth conversation for everyone.
Right. I mean, you know, it's like one of these conversations that is so exhausting and just so fruitless. And to me, what I really wanted to think about was, I mean, a couple of things. So one thing is I knew that I didn't want to pathologize Black people in talking about colorism, because I think that it is often a conversation that is sort of, you know, what's wrong with those Black people? Why can't they, you know, it's like colorism is far beyond just Black people who experience this, you know, like lots of other types of communities. And I've been hearing from lots of other people from different ethnic groups who have been talking about colorism within their own community. So one thing is that it's not just specific to Black people, but also obviously it's a phenomenon that is the, you know, descendant of white supremacy. So it doesn't come from nowhere. So I didn't want to write about it as if this was just some, you know, peculiarity of Black people. And isn't that funny that they feel, you know, I was trying to avoid all of those things. And I really just wanted to think about colorism as something that is institutionalized in this place. Like it's something that is almost formalized in this town. So I want to think about that, and also just thinking about the way that it feels for these characters to experience it. I think that that's one of the things that you can do in fiction, which is thinking about how feelings can be embodied, and particularly this character Jude, who you meet at the very beginning of the book. She's Desiree's dark-skinned daughter, and the experience and the trauma and the violence that she experiences growing up in this place, and how she carries that with her even once she has left that town behind. She can't quite break herself free of this really toxic ideology that she has been fed her entire life.
So you're from San Diego, and I think it's, you know, so interesting. In a lot of ways, it makes perfect sense why this would be in Louisiana, because I do also think that the concept of colorism is different in Louisiana. Like I think of one of my mom's best friends is very light, her whole family, like truly probably passing, but are absolutely Black people, would never identify as anything else. Like the way it functions there is a little different. So, you know, and San Diego is like a very white conservative place and all that. So I'm wondering like how you arrived at Louisiana for the setting for a lot of this novel.
Yeah. So my mom is also from Louisiana.
Look at that. Look at that.
There you go. Look at that. And that was a big part of it for me. She was kind of the source of me thinking about this novel. As you were saying, you know, my mom's family, my mom was one of is one of 9 children. And, you know, my mom is, you know, a little bit lighter than us. But, you know, she has a sister who has red hair and pale skin, you know, so all those things that you're saying, my mom would tell me stories about like how they had cousins who would only ask to play with her sister and not her, even though they were around the same age. And like experiencing those sort of things, you know, within your family or within your own community on these kind of small personal levels. So I was thinking about that and the ways in which color manifests in that very specific context. And then just kind of wanted to push it to its extremes and think about the idea of colorism that's not just interpersonal, you know, cruelty, but also sort of institutionalized within a town.
Yeah. So on the subject of passing, you have a trans character in the book, Reese, who also spends some of the novel doing a version of passing himself. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about your decision to tell these kind of parallel types of stories about passing and how they're similar and how they're different.
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest fear of writing these stories in conjunction with one another was the idea that they would be conflated somehow. Because I was really interested in these stories because of the ways that they are kind of different. So for me, you know, I think I thought of Reese as a counterpoint to Stella. They're both characters that reinvent themselves in these kind of big dramatic ways. But really, you know, I thought of Reese's journey as one that was actually towards affirmation and him sort of changing physically in a way that affirmed who he is and who he's always been, versus Stella, who's a character who doesn't really change physically. She doesn't even take on a new name, but she becomes this completely different person mentally and emotionally and psychologically. So I really love the idea of those characters kind of being sort of in conflict with each other, and those stories being pressed against each other in this way that I found really interesting. And yeah, I love the idea that a lot of themes I was interested in were sort of these themes about reinvention and what people gain in deciding to be somebody else and what you potentially lose. And I think Reese and Stella are also different in that way, because Reese's journey is one towards liberation, I would say. Stella's probably not so much. I think her journey is a bit different. I don't think that it's quite as liberating as Reese's journey.
I mean, this is maybe tricky because I'm sure as an author you care deeply about all of your characters, but you know, I read Stella and I feel bad for her. Like, I'm like, oh, I think one, just like rejecting Blackness in that way is, it's hard to comprehend because I literally couldn't, but I also like, I get why you would, and I also get why you wouldn't. But it also just makes me sad that she didn't get to be a Black woman. And, you know, and so when I read that, I feel bad for her, and I wonder if that's the, you know, if that's what I was supposed to kind of take from that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess it's complicated for me, I think. So I think there is a side of me that is right on board with you as far as finding the idea of deciding to not be Black pretty unthinkable, to be honest. And obviously that's not a choice I would ever have the option to make. Right. But it is something that I find unthinkable. And not only that, but the decision to leave your family behind. I have two older sisters who I'm very close to. I'm close to my parents. So the idea of making any choice that would lead me to never talk to them again, that is also unthinkable to me. That being said, I think that while I felt bad for Stella, I think there's also a part of Stella, the idea of, you know, the idea of just kind of shedding your past and completely starting over. It's something that has always been appealing to me in theory. I've never done it, certainly not as dramatically as Stella does, but I'm always like, when I, you know, back in pre-COVID times where we could travel, I loved going to a new city where I knew nobody and just walking around, and like that idea of just kind of completely starting over. There is something I think potentially liberating about that. And I always thought of Stella's choice as being one in the direction of that more even than in the direction of whiteness itself. Like, I think for her, whiteness is kind of a means to an end. It's not the end. And once I started to think about her like that, I think her choice became more intelligible to me, of thinking about, you know, who has not wanted to just move somewhere new and start completely over? I think everybody kind of thinks about it a little bit. So that made her decision a bit more intelligible to me.
So when I was reading, I was waiting for her to get found out.
Yes. Because
part of me is like, someone's going to figure this out. Surely a Black person is going to roll up and be like, this Black person here. Why didn't she ever get, you know, even with her daughter, even with Kennedy, it's like, she knows, but not really, you know, like she does know, but it doesn't necessarily result in something super concrete about the way that their life functions. And so why didn't she get found out?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And, you know, I think that as I was writing the book, I thought about that too. I imagine all of these different ways in which Stella could sort of be exposed. But, you know, I think a couple reasons. I mean, one is exactly what you said, that you were expecting it. So there was a part of me that's like, I want to flout your expectations as a writer. I want to take you in a different direction. There's that part of me. And I think also there's kind of this larger thing that I was thinking about of sort of the literatures of passing, which almost always result in the character who's passing being discovered, and almost always end quite tragically. And there's something about that I kind of rejected, because I felt that by punishing somebody who is passing, you're almost affirming those categories themselves as being these sort of impermissible categories, and they're not. You know, we know that they're not. So there's a way in which I felt like by punishing Stella for passing, I'm like affirming whiteness for, you know, like she stole something, she took something by, you know, and there was a way in which I rejected that. So I think a lot of it was just kind of knowing what some reader expectations were going to be, and wanting to flout that in a way that felt different. And I think also just because the more interesting question to me was always kind of like, what next? What next? What next?
Right.
And that question kind of ends if Stella gets caught and punished or thwarted in some way.
I kind of have the same question for Desiree, which by the way, is my mother's name.
Love it.
I like opened the book and I was like, what? But you know, I think less so than Stella for me, but I think you can also read her life as sad in a way. And you know, not who has the sadder life, but I guess, you know, how would you respond to, like, you know, the idea that Desiree is the one who led the sad life?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's also a really interesting read, because I think on one hand you could think, okay, Stella is very tragic because she lives her life in secrecy and she doesn't have friends and community. But at the same time, you know, she's, you know, gets married, she has a kid, she's living pretty large in LA, she's got a nice car, you know, like she does a lot of things that she wants to do. And I think in a lot of ways, Desiree's life is kind of these thwarted ambitions in certain ways. You know, she you know, has this skill that she develops as a fingerprint analyst, and then has to basically leave that behind because she returns to this small town where she can't find that type of technical work, you know, and she's kind of stays in this house with her mother for almost all of her, or for most of her adult life, that at least that we see in the book. So, and I think that there is something also that could be sad about that. But I just loved, you know, I love the idea of, I don't know, I was drawn to both of them, and the sadness within both of those choices, because I didn't think there was really, you know, well, clearly Desiree made like, you know, there's a version of Desiree's life where she never returns back to that town. And she goes somewhere, you know, so there are all these different versions, but I love the idea of the one who, you know, from the beginning is got to get out of there. She's the one who kind of ends up stuck there. The other one you think that would be happy there is the one who leaves and just doesn't go back. So I loved the idea of that, those kind of, again, inverted expectations about those characters.
Yeah. So one of, like, my favorite relationship in the book was weirdly between Stella and Loretta. Because I mean, one, I loved, like, again, just speaking to, like, versions of Black people that we don't see as often, like a wealthy Black family in that time period moving into that neighborhood and having money and being, you know, and I could see this woman, and I love those visions of Black people. But it sort of reminded me of, I think less so as I've been an adult, but when I was younger, friends of mine who were biracial, who were trying to figure out their own identity. And I found myself to be wild and unhelpful because I was like, I mean, like, you're Black, I'm Black, I can't really help you with, especially because, you know, I have so many family members who I'm like, are lighter than you.
Right.
So just in terms of how you present to the world, I'm like, you're a Black person to me. But you know, the idea of Stella seeking out a Black female relationship, and doing so in a awkward way. But I'm wondering, like, do you think, you know, in this world where the book continues on, like, did she take something from that relationship with Loretta?
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that that's your favorite relationship. I think you're the first person who's told me
Am I
that.
the first?
I think you are. I love it though. I mean, yeah, I think that was, I loved writing Loretta for all those reasons that you pointed out. The idea of this being a woman who's pretty fabulous and confident, and the idea that also, like, you know, this is a Black family that moves into this neighborhood, and Stella kind of looking at this is like, well, maybe there's a version of my life where I could have been sort of Loretta, where I married a Black man and I like claimed myself as Black, and I still could have ended up here somehow, you know?
Right.
So I loved the idea of that. But I also love that kind of awkward, halting friendship that is, from the beginning, there's these weird negotiations of power. You know, there's the idea of Stella like seeking something very desperately from Loretta, and like you said, Loretta being unwilling or unable to give that to her. The idea that Loretta kind of reads that Stella is just like has a lot of white guilt that she's trying to unload on her. And the reader knows that she does feel guilty, but it's maybe, I don't know if you call that white guilt. I don't know how to call that,
right.
that emotion of what Stella's feeling, but she is trying to unload this guilt, but it's for a different reason really than how Loretta is kind of interpreting it. So I love the idea of that, just this weird, complicated adult friendship, which I think is also just in general can be weird, making as adults. So that on top of all the layers of sort of identity and power that they are negotiating, I found that to be really interesting too. So I love that part of the book. I didn't originally set out to write that friendship. I just thought, okay, this family, this is like a conflict that's going to be introduced of Stella trying to keep this Black family out of the neighborhood. And that's how you kind of meet her as, you know, sort of adult Stella. But then I started to think, okay, well, what if the Black family moves into the neighborhood? And then what happens next? And that's what became really interesting to me to think about.
I didn't even think about like the idea of seeing a Black woman essentially in the same position that she's in and being like, damn, I didn't even have to do all that. Like,
right.
I could have just found the right man.
Right, exactly.
I think I have not thought of that, and I love that.
Exactly.
So briefly, we'll talk about some men.
Okay.
So, you know, Stella and Desiree, they have really complex, I mean, all of the women in the book, Kennedy, Jude, they all have really sort of complex relationships with men. So this is a question actually from Andrea's daughter. So she says, the only intact family is Stella's, which is deeply dysfunctional. Why are all the men outsiders and damaged goods? I love this question.
Evergreen question, right?
Yeah,
why
truly,
are all the men damaged goods?
Why are men terrible and we don't have a good answer for you? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think of a few things. So, I mean, I think one thing is I found this idea of family really interesting in this book. Because even the idea of like, what is an intact family and what are the assumptions that we make about something like that? So like Stella's family is the only sort of nuclear family. But in a lot of ways, like Desiree and Early, who are kind of like live-in lovers for all these years, they have a much stronger relationship than Stella has with Blake, you know, and Jude and Reese, who don't get legally married, but they are like life partners and they have a stronger relationship than, you know, so I was always kind of interested in these relationships that are not considered maybe nuclear families, but that still end up being a lot more sort of emotionally supportive and protective in that way. So that's one thing. I mean, I think about as far as why are the men outsiders? I mean, I think a big part of that is just like I realized very early on as a writer that I am just overwhelmingly interested in the lives of women. And you know, obviously there are male characters in my books. But
unavoidable.
You know, there are male characters in my books, but I know that, you know, like, so early on there was Stella and Desiree had like a brother, you know, there were 3 kids, and I thought, well, that'll be really interesting if there's like a 3rd kid in the family, and then I started writing it and I was like, actually this is not interesting to me. I'm actually way more interested in Desiree's relationship with Stella and with her mother than I am with this like phantom brother. Who I ended up cutting, although I really liked the character. So I think a lot of that for me is just being really interested in the lives of women and girls and the relationships between and among us and whatever way that they appear. And that's just, I think, where my kind of personal interest as a writer lie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as far as the men being damaged goods, I mean, I will say in defense of, not to not all men this question, but in the defense of some of the men in the book, I think I loved writing Early and I loved writing Reese, because I think that both of them are damaged in some way, but they're not toxic,
Right.
They are both men who try really hard. They are respectful to their partners. They both have like a gentleness or like a sweetness to them, even if they're not necessarily, well, at least Early is not effusive with his emotions,
Mm-hmm.
but he feels very deeply and he cares and he shows that he cares. So I had a few men in the book that I thought, were really stand-up guys. And then obviously there are many that are not. So that's a roundabout way of saying, I think a lot of this is just realizing that the relationships I'm honestly most interested in when I'm writing are between and among women and girls.
Yeah.
I've realized that about myself. I've accepted it about myself as a writer, and I decide to just kind of stay in the space that I'm most interested in.
I mean, something that I love so much was, obviously Jude and Reese's relationship just throughout the years, but like this, I think I have PTSD where I'm waiting for the trauma, and to see this dark-skinned Black girl just be loved in a really like tender and beautiful and soft and like unconditional way. Part of me, like the sort of lack of surprise with that relationship, I really appreciated, because I think you kept waiting for him, him to maybe not, you waited for something to blow it up, and it did, but it didn't. And just the refreshingness of seeing of this woman just being supported and loved was like depressing how surprising that was.
I mean, I think a big part of that, like for me with that relationship, I always thought of that relationship as kind of the romantic center of the book. And I think a big part of it was, one, just because of what you're saying, all of the things that Jude undergoes as a child growing up in this place. I wanted to see her be loved for those reasons that you're saying. I wanted to see her find friendship and community and to escape this like unbearable loneliness that she has been subjected to because her skin is dark. So that was part of it, was just kind of my own wish fulfillment as a person who has invented these characters and is thinking about them and cares about them. But I think there was also part of me that was, my first book, The Mothers. There were some very toxic relationships between women and men in that book. And I really wanted to do something different. It was almost like a challenge of like, can I write a relationship that is soft? Like, can I write a relationship that is tender? And I think in a lot of ways it can be harder to write tenderness than toxicity. So that was something that I really challenged myself to. I'm sorry to tell everybody the next book has a toxic relationship. I went back to the brand, but this one, it was nice to have a tender relationship.
I mean, it's got to come back somehow. I also like reading Kennedy. To me, it kind of reminded me of I'm not going to remember this character's name, but in Such a Fun Age, because it was this pitch perfect depiction of a certain type of white woman. And so I love that reading Black women like just like nail it. Like I was like, oh, this is like, I know 30 of these people. But like, and to me, one of the least sympathetic characters, I think probably deliberately. But I guess just, even their relationship, again, kind of expecting another shoe to drop with how Kennedy would react. And it was also what I found as I was reading it, I was like, when is this white girl going to figure out that she's not lying? I was like, why would anyone, I was like, she is not, like, Jude is like telling you over and over again. And I was like, she is really not getting it. And so I guess just, can you talk about that character and I don't know, was it cathartic to write her?
I actually had a lot of fun writing Kennedy. It's probably one of the most fun characters to write. I mean, one is just personality. It's so fun to write people that are different from you as far as demeanor. So to write this character who just kind of never stops talking and is very entitled and sort of cocky. There's something really fun about writing that. And I think also like writing her journey through whiteness was fun because I do think that she goes through, it is a journey, you know, she goes through this moment. And I think for her, I'm always very interested in the idea of people discovering that their racial background is different than what they have believed it to be. I find all these stories about that now that people are doing, you know, 23andMe or you know, DNA things. And you have like, you know, one side, you have the sort of white supremacists who realize that, you know, they have whatever and they like, you know, freak out or they just utterly reject the results. They're just like, well, I don't think it's accurate. And then, you know, on the flip side, you know, I read one about this woman who was adopted and grew up believing herself to be Black and learned that she was not. So I'm always interested in how people react to these types of things, people who accept it and embrace it, or people who reject it because it just contradicts the reality that they have believed, the reality of race, and whatever way that race is real. And so there's that kind of thing, and that made Kennedy really interesting to me of, okay, well, how is she going to react when confronted with this? And then sort of this question of like, okay, once she accepts it, what does that change about her, if anything? Because like the story I was saying about this woman who believed herself to be Black, you know, she had grown up, she went to an HBCU, she'd been in all the Black organizations, you know, so at that point she's just like, I am Black, like you know, and because that was the way that she was, late. It was too late, you know. So I'm always interested in that for Kennedy. Is she someone who's like, well, now I'm going to go join an organization, you know? She never struck me as somebody who'd be like, well, I'm joining the NAACP now that I, you know, like, no, Kennedy's not going to do that, you know, but at the same time, she is experiencing this kind of existential crisis that's manifesting in these different ways in her life. And the fact that this is happening to somebody who's an actor and who kind of makes a living off of pretending to be other people was something that just felt ironic and fun. So I enjoyed writing that character a lot, but I think that was really what interested me, was kind of what do you do when confronted with this information about yourself that you didn't know? Do you accept it? Do you reject it? Do you just move on from it? How does that sort of play out in her life?
Well, I think you actually did depict the most accurate reaction, which was her relationship with Franz, who I was like, I was not triggered, but I was like, a lot of people are going to be triggered because I was like, I hate both of these people. I hate this relationship and everything that's happening. And it's like, you know these people.
Yeah.
But the way that she uses it, I wouldn't say she weaponizes it, but she uses it at very specific times to bring it up. She brings it up, of course, only to another person of color, because I think there's nothing, you know, if you were a white passing person and you said to a white person, well, I'm a quarter Black, it's like, okay.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing even to be proved with that. But I think you nailed like how someone would respond to that and how they would use it in their personal life.
Yeah. No, I mean, thank you. And I you know, I think that relationship was also like, you know, fun to write. I think for those reasons that you said, you know, the idea of, you know, what it means to like belong to a sort of type, like to be somebody's type. And the sort of disturbing thing about like the disturbing implications of that. But I think what you're saying is real. Like there's a way in which, you know, she's looking to Black people to either affirm or reject her, and nobody is really doing either thing. Like, you know, even Jude is not like, welcome to the fold, you know, nobody is really giving her what she wants, which is some type of absolute kind of definitive answer, because there is no absolute definitive answer of like what, you know, of sort of how to feel about your identity. You know, there is no answer that anyone can give her, but that's what she's asking all these Black people for, and is sort of constantly disappointed when nobody can actually provide that answer to her.
Yeah. So looking at Desiree and Stella as sisters, and you know, I feel like, you know, in the Mothers, they weren't sisters, but they were sisters.
Right.
You know, and I guess what makes that relationship different in the way that she walked away. You know, I think for women who I think form stronger bonds with their friends and in an emotional way than on a more regular basis than men, perhaps, like that sort of break in a friendship is like losing family. It is really traumatic and really hard. but still different than this break between these two sisters. And
Right.
I mean, obviously you said you have two sisters and you're very close to them, but like what you were kind of like meditating on in terms of sisterhood with
Right.
the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's the other thing that I've realized that I'm I think always kind of writing toward is the idea of sisterhood. And the mothers, like you said, it's sort of chosen sisterhood in that book. This is obviously biological, and even the next project I'm thinking on is this sort of form of sisterhood at the center of it. I think I'm always interested in sort of the intimacy of those relationships, but also the tension at the heart of them. I think, you know, there's obviously love, or maybe not obviously, but in my relationships, there's love, there's trust, but I think often there can be this, you know, comparison of like, you know, my life versus yours, your choices versus mine. There can be that kind of tension at the heart of it. There can be all of these sort of, you know, frictions of being in these relationships that are sort of claustrophobically close. And that's, I think, the case for Desiree and Stella, is that they are so close. They feel like they can't really survive without each other. And that's a scary sort of place to be in any relationship. So I think that I'm always drawn by the fact that these sister relationships feel so important and intimate, but at the same time can be really fraught and tense. So I think that's one reason I think that I'm always kind of interested in writing toward it. And I think in this book, I think in both books there's sort of pretty traumatic kind of breaks in those relationships. But I think in this book particularly, the fact that they are twins and that they go on to live, you know, the majority of their adult lives apart, and establish their own identities, which is maybe good. Maybe that's actually healthier than if they had stayed in that town together the whole time. But at the same time, it's still quite painful.
This is a swerve of a question, but what were you reading, watching while you were writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, there were some things that were just kind of more research based. So if anybody's interested in the history of passing, there's a book called A Chosen Exile by Allison Hobbs. It's really good. It's a history book, and she talks about just the history of passing, and she gives lots of really interesting episodes in the book. So that was something that was really helpful to me. And I think I was also just thinking of revisiting a lot of the kind of literature of passing. So Passing by Nella Larson, obviously, which is also kind of, maybe I guess I wouldn't call that chosen sisterhood, but there is a fraught relationship between women at the heart of it. So I love that. So that book, I think Caucasia by Danzy Senna is also another really great book about passing that's more modern, and also about sisters. So that's a great one. And I also revisited Imitation of Life, which, you know, I think is probably
a standard.
A standard, I would say, probably one of our most iconic stories about passing. And I think a weird thing about rewatching that was just realizing that the sort of passing story is kind of the B plot of that movie. You know, like the A plot is like the white family and the woman is becoming an entrepreneur, and like there's like this whole story that's happening with that. But no one ever talks about that when we talk about Imitation of Life. It's weird to think about that as I was revisiting it. But it was also, I think that was the first story I really saw about passing when I was a child. My mom showed me that movie. So it was really interesting to rewatch it as I was thinking about the themes of this book.
How do you, like, you know, this book being out now, obviously you did not predict the revolution. Yes. But I think of like seeing, like there was something going around Twitter, I feel like a month ago, that was like, Beethoven is black. And you're like, you know, like everyone's like, oh my God, Beethoven's black. And it's this like, I get why people think that's helpful. You know what I mean? Or like, I get how you arrive at like, I'm doing something by sharing that.
Yes.
But I also just think it's such an interesting time because people are, mostly white people, are both very receptive, but you're also realizing like, oh, we're not really equipped to be, we have been thrust into very complicated, deep conversations. And you're like, oh, a lot of you are not qualified to have these conversations, but you're having them anyway.
Yes.
And it's like, should you just take, like, is it just great we're having it?
Yeah.
Or is it like, oh no, like everyone needs to like go and regroup before we do this. And so I think I'm wondering, like, this book that's touching on, I mean, you know, just it being out now and just what we're talking about. I'm wondering how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly feel, it's completely strange and surreal. The day the book came out was the day that everybody was doing the black squares on Instagram. Uh, it feels like a lifetime ago, right? But that was the morning my book came out. It was like,
oh my God.
And it's both. I felt like there was a receptiveness towards the themes of this book. That I don't know that would have happened if the book had come out 2 weeks earlier or even 2 weeks later,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like, I don't know if the reception would have been the same. But at the same time, I think you're right as far as the conversations that we're having on race, which I think most frustrating to me is I think they are veering almost entirely toward the symbolic, which is the symbolism of Beethoven being black. That idea, like that holds some cultural meaning to us because,
Right.
Like we have so many examples of black genius that,
Right.
It's sort of like, what are we reading into this, of this being some type of
Quincy Jones exists. We don't need
yeah,
Beethoven.
exactly. So that's straight, so there's that feeling of that. But I think also what you're saying about this sort of larger sort of conversation, I think one thing that I have come to realize is just, the idea of sort of doing the required reading before you raise your hand. I saw somebody who tweeted that the other day. And there's something about that being really palpable because I think a lot of people have not done the reading. And the idea that, sort of black people, that we just know race because we are black. Like, no, we had to learn race, we learned it through our experiences. We learned it through parents and family members and books and movies, all these things. Mm-hmm. We have constantly been learning race our entire lives. And there are lots of people who just started learning race, 6 weeks ago when they bought white fragility, and it's sort of like trying to have a conversation with somebody who has been studying and thinking about and engaging critically with something for decades versus someone who has been thinking about it for a few weeks. That's not to say that conversation is not, it's not necessarily, good or anything, but it becomes frustrating, I think for those reasons. I've always had to think critically about my identity, and there are lots of people who have just now started to think about what it means to be white, so that's the thing. I think that's what I hope, and so far as people doing the reading, which is not to say that books are going to solve your problems, and they're not anti-racist serum just because you bought white fragility. It's not just going to make you a better person, all this. I'm not saying that, but I think as far as learning how to think critically about race, learning how to actually do that work that lots of us have already been doing. I think that's the vital thing. It's not just putting a black square on Instagram. It's not just buying a book. It's not just, so that's what I hope comes out of this moment. But I think what I worry about is sort of veering towards, the symbolism and being like, look, we did a thing. We changed the name of Aunt Jemima syrup, and okay, sure. Like people have been complaining about this for a long time. We've known it was racist for a long time, but at the same time, like nobody is asking for that. We are asking for institutional and systemic change.
I mean, in a lot of ways, that was sort of like the thesis around me starting my book club, which was, I think in a lot of ways, reading a book like this, like The Vanishing Half, is more fruitful than reading White Fragility. Because by the way, when you read White Fragility, you're still reading about white people. It's just a lot, like, I was reading Dying of Whiteness, and I got like a third of the way through it, and I was like, oh, so they're racist.
Yeah.
And it was like, okay. And it's still centering white people. And I think in a lot of ways, these stories that, it's the way that, like, if you have black friends and they've never talked to you about race, like, they're not really your friends.
Yeah.
Like, sorry.
Yeah.
And I think, something like getting into sort of the crevices of people, of our lives, in a way that's not about the worst thing that's ever happened to us or the most violent thing that has happened to us or whatever it is like, this is most of our life. Like most of our lives is this stuff through the lens of, yes, we are black women. And so that changes the way that, it changes the outcome of the situation somewhat, but like, that's my real life more than being pulled over by the cops is my real life.
Right. I mean, I think so. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is because it really is a book about sort of conflicts between and among black people, like there's a way in which I think the book is some people talk about the book as like an interrogation of whiteness. And I think that that's true, but I think that that's a much smaller part of the book. I think a larger part of what I was interested in writing it was about these, you know, these characters who are mostly Black characters who are moving in the world, who are trying to figure themselves out, who are trying to figure out their relationships and their ambitions and all those things that you said that make up our lives. I was much more interested in that than a drama that would somehow just center whiteness even more than it is already sort of centered in our culture.
So this is my last question. We're wrapping up, but apparently there were a lot of inquiries about people wanting to write the script. Obviously, I should be writing the script. Anyway, but I'm wondering how you imagine this on screen, since it's certainly going to be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to think about what it could look like, and I think for the reasons that we said at the very beginning is that there aren't a lot of shows like this. There aren't a lot of sort of limited series that are like this. You know, just about regular Black people, and it's period piece, and there's that element. So I'm really excited for that. I'm excited to see whoever is brought on as the writer. I don't know yet. But you know, I think for me, what was really important to me was just the series maintaining the nuance of the book, because I think there are so many themes in this book that could be very clumsy if handled clumsily. So I want to maintain that nuance and in sort of the diversity of the world in the book amongst all these Black people who are also different in all these different places and times. Like, I want to maintain that for sure. I think those are the really important things to me, and also just for it to be aesthetically beautiful. I just want to see something that looks beautiful when you're looking at it, and to see these characters live out their full and complex lives on the screen.
Some well-lit Black people.
Well-lit Black people, yes.
You know, Brit, you've got so much work to do. You've got to finish your new book really fast because we want to read it. And
maybe don't finish it, because the world might end if you finish the second book.
That's true.
And you've got to really push HBO to hurry up, because you know, there were 1,000 people who wanted to know who's in this. So thank you so much, both of you. Kara, thank you. Brit, thank you completely. And I can't wait to read your next thing. And you too, Kara.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody.